Hey, this is the Fight Nerd, and we are back for the Old School MMA review once again. Joined as always by Zane Simon from BloodyElbow.com. Zane, how's it going on the other side of the screen?
You know what? It's so much greener over here. Super green.
It really is. You need to change your color balance or something. That must be what it is.
That's right. I've just got a touch of the gangrene.
You want to get that looked at? I don't know. Just a thought. I don't really want to get a new co-host now.
Eh, I mean, I'm replaceable. Oh, you can have my dog. You can have my dog host it. I'll just put the headphone on her.
We'd probably get a lot of traffic just for having that dog on screen. You should put that dog on camera right now.
It's true. Here, I'll put. Oh, she's no. Well, okay, yes. Oh, there. Oh,
That's a big dog.
proud and noble animal. Give us traffic, people, because I've got a cute dog.
That's how you do it. That's how we internet, y'all.
That's right. All right, Molly, you can go back to bed now.
So we are here now after our long tallying session. We took a look at Choke, as you guys saw last time. We did our first documentary review, and now we are back finally to announce the winners of our first ever Old School Mixed Martial Arts Review Award Show, Volume 1. What a long and lengthy, stupid name I gave that show.
Yeah, that and calling everything best ever, I think really threw a lot of people.
Yeah. Our awards were supposed to basically take from what we've watched in the show, which is UFC 1 to Ultimate 96, and take the best and worst out of that. But we had a few people who were looking a little bit forward to the future, if you will. And we're not there yet, but that's what the second award show is going to be all about. So, yeah, let's get through our first one, and let's hand out some Golden Andy Anderson awards, shall we?
The Andes, as I like to call them.
The Golden Andys. Nothing. We're gonna have a golden shower of Andy Andersons today, folks.
We're so done.
You show the dog. It's all right. We're gonna get like all sorts of new traffic just for that. We're good.
Okay, you're right.
All right. So
We've already been classy, so we can be not classy. So start everything off. Our first category was best mismatched opponents, which mismatched opponents, especially in classic MMA, are the best thing really. The nominees were Keith Hackney versus Emmanuel Yarbrough from UFC 3, Keith Hackney versus Joe Sun from UFC 4, Dan Severn versus Anthony Macias from UFC 4, and Mark Coleman versus Julian Sanchez from UFC 10. And the winner was Emmanuel Yarbrough versus Keith Hackney, which one of our readers, Hummus5989, said, "From everything we've seen, sumo translates to fighting about as well as it does to gymnastics, and he wasn't even particularly good at sumo."
that is very true. And
Very
yeah,
true.
I would agree with that choice. I have to agree with our readers and our listeners in this one here. Hackney Yarbrough from UFC 3, the giant versus little tiny dude. It really was an enormous weight difference, the biggest to this date in the UFC. And that was still also a really, really good match compared to the other ones. Like, Macias and Severn has that awesome suplex spot. But again, it's like Severn doing it to a guy half his size. It's not really as impressive as seeing a little guy take out the big guy in the way that Keith Hackney did.
Well, and I think it has the thrill of mismatch, not just in the fact that visually they were very mismatched, but in terms of talent, they were also incredibly mismatched.
Yes, absolutely. It was really just size versus skill in that match, and that was a perfect way to do those early UFCs.
It was. It was, and like I say, those are always some of the most fun bouts from early MMAs. Watching, it's like Zulu Zinho versus Fedor. Sure, it's complete circus grade entertainment, but damn it, who doesn't love clowns?
That's true. I still actually love that match because it's just so bad and so good at the same time. We had also one of our other Bloody Elbow readers, Deuce McNasty, who voted. He voted the opposite direction. He didn't. Yeah, that's a great name. We're going to be reading all these great Bloody Elbow names today. It actually sounds when you hear it out loud. So we heard from Deuce McNasty, who voted for Joe Sun versus Hackney from UFC 4. And he said he could watch Joe Sun get punched in the balls all day and it would still be funny. And I'd have to agree with that, but it wasn't enough to edge out the win for Yarbrough and Hackney, unfortunately.
Yeah, Keith Hackney really was the master of terribly mismatched fights early on.
He was. He had a tough time. He got Yarbrough. He had Royce Gracie later on at UFC 4. He had Joe Son. He was the king of the sideshow in the early UFCs.
Very much so. So, our next category.
Yes, sir. Next category up is best promo and interview. This was a tough category, mostly because I think a lot of our readers had to actually remember what these promos were, because a lot of them were a little
Yeah.
complicated. So this was a tough category, but our nominees for the Andy is the Goodridge Superior Mind interview, the Don Fry promo where he told everyone to lock up their wives and daughters, Scott Frozo's Ric Flair style promo, anything that Tank Abbott has ever said on camera, all of Severin's UFC 5 promo videos, Joe Son using the power of Christ to win at UFC 4, and finally, Harold Howard admitting that yes, he indeed loves his family. And our winner it was Tank Abbott. Anything that Tank Abbott says was the winner. And Don Fry's Lock Up Your Wives and Daughters came in second. But for the most part, this was all Tank Abbott in this category.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I think, for pure entertainment value, Tank Abbott was probably the right choice, but personally, my favorite was Goodrich and his Superior Mind. I loved Gary Goodrich's
Yeah,
early
that was
UFC.
a good.
Oh, just lost you for a second.
I think we have a little bit. I think we have a little bit of delay on our videos, folks. But yeah, the Gary Goodrich promos were very good, and that's just because they weren't only just a promo, but they were also basically his catchphrase in the early UFCs. He was constantly spouting that, even though I lost this fight, I still have superior mind and superior body and superior pectoral muscles and whatever else he would babble on about. So that was kind of his thing. But I would go with Tank Abbott as well for this one, because anytime that man opens his mouth, I'm listening.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, Tank Abbott was the breath of fresh air from the beefed up muscle dudes who were just trying to sell their home workout videotapes. Suddenly there was Tank Abbott who was just, rolling off a bar stool and into the octagon. But I'm still partial to Goodrich because it did really sound like he was trying to sell you personal instructional videos.
So yeah, that's our first disagreement there is Zane with Goodrich, and I'm surprised actually Goodrich didn't come in second. I actually thought his were better. I do agree with that. I'm surprised Fry came in second, but it was a tight category. I do like Bloody Elbow commentator Gregarious D, who said before Sonicser with a goatee, and yeah, he was the mouthpiece of the UFC in those early days. He was the bad boy.
It's true. And one person voted for Harold Howard. It was Almond Milk, who said, "We have a saying back home: if you're coming on, come on." Which, yeah, that was.
Yeah, he was voting for Harold Howard's other promo, which
Uh,
I don't know why we didn't include that one. Actually, I'm kind of surprised we forgot about that one and we went with the Harold Howard admitting he loves his family. But they're both pretty good. I mean, so either way,
yeah,
a vote for Harold Howard is a vote for Harold Howard.
it's true.
That sounds like his political soapbox right there. A vote for Harold Howard is a vote for Harold Howard.
Uh, so our third category was, and this was, I think this was a category I really pushed for, and I love to watch. It's also one of my favorite things, along with mismatched fights to watch for in early UFCs. Were just guys tapping out to absolutely nothing in particular. Just pure fear and adrenaline dump, slapping the mat because they had no idea how to tap out and nobody had really done it before. And that was always great to see. So our tap out to nothing in particular, Andy's nominees were Art Jimerson versus Hoist Gracie at UFC 1, Todd Medina versus Larry Curitan at UFC 6, and of course, infamously, Don Fry versus Mark Hall at Ultimate 96. The Andy Award goes to Art Jimerson versus Hoist Gracie. Totally unsurprised. Almond Milk once again summing it up, saying that er, that fight is legendary. And another commenter, 42, said, "On campfire storytelling quality alone, this one should be awarded the prize."
Yes, and it absolutely was. And again, I'm going to agree with this one. Art versus Hoist from the first UFC. wow, just wow. That's really all I can say about that fight. It is tremendous to tell people about that story, and especially as we've learned more history behind that fight, the story's gotten even better each time it gets told, because it becomes more and more realistic. We're hearing all the backstory, and you guys can go back and watch our first UFC discussion to actually hear more about that. But there actually was a lot of discussion in the comments over this one, and this one was one of our more commented posts about this contest. A lot of discussion over Don Fry versus Mark Hall being the worst because it was a fixed fight. So that's an interesting point there, is which one is actually worse? Is it worse tapping out after being paid a ton of money? Or, well, basically it's the same difference, isn't it, really? I mean, at least Art Jimerson actually tried to fight, as
Yeah.
opposed to Mark Hall, who just kind of took the dive and did his pro wrestling sell.
Yeah, I mean, either way, you had somebody who wasn't really going to fight if anything went wrong at all.
Yeah, one commenter, MT King, who voted for Fry versus Hall, said that he agreed with that sentiment. That he said, "I think taking a dive is much worse than not understanding jiu-jitsu. It's shameful, in my opinion, to be honest. Why wouldn't Jimerson tap out? He was clueless about what to do. Why risk having his arm broke?" And that's a good point, as opposed to Mark Hall, who just said, "All right, give me the monies and I'll tap."
Yeah, and of course, but that's also to the fact that Art Hall, or that not Art Hall, that Hall had already lost to Fry twice at that point. But that's just one of those little idiosyncrasies in early MMA. Was the rare time that two guys actually fought a bunch, and at one point were just like, you know what, screw it, let's not actually do this anymore.
Yeah, all right. So let's move on into our next category, which is our best fake fighting style. And as you guys remember, the early UFCs were loaded with fake fighting styles. So this was a big category, and our nominees for that are John Hess's SAFTA, Cal Worsham's RFTA, which is essentially almost an offshoot of SAFTA, which is hard to believe that anything could be an offshoot of SAFTA. That alone makes it worth nominating.
Seems like
We
only
have
Shame could be an offshoot of SAFTA.
uh, isn't that what the S in SAFTA stands for?
I think it is.
So we have SAFTA, RFTA, pit fighting, which is Tank Abbott's alleged style, and that he was also the champion of that style somehow. Paul Varlin's trap fighting, which was to this day never really explained very well, even though it kind of sort of is a thing, but not with what Paul Varlin was doing. And lastly, Joe Sun's Joe Sun Do. And this was a pretty close category, but once again, Tank Abbott gets the win. Our winner is pit fighting.
Yeah, I was surprised. I would have voted for SAFTA. SAFTA is my favorite fake style because it was so obvious that the guy doing it had never even fought before in his life, let alone, like let alone practiced some martial art. It was just like, it was the backyard wrestling of MMA preparation.
Absolutely, and I think that's a tough one to go with too. I mean, I'm a little bit on the fence. I think I'd probably go with SAFTA as well on that one, and that's no surprise because SAFTA came in second, and it was only off by one vote.
Yeah.
So one vote difference for this category, tight category. Although Joe Sundo, I guess, came in third. Although apparently he was DQ'd a lot for just being a terrible person, and that happened in pretty much any category he was in.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, we kind of included Joe Sonala because I mean, his story is one of the bigger stories of the early UFC events. It's one of the most notable he's one of the most notable figures, tragically, from those early UFC events. So he popped up a lot. But I think it's also fair to then, to every time he's mentioned, bring up his legacy of being a terrible murdering rapist.
Yes. Yeah, we can never ever forget that. Never forget Joe Sun. And one of our Bloody Elbow commenters, Rainier Lee, asked why we didn't include Bone Breaking, which was from, I believe, was that Tank Abbott's debut?
Yeah, it was his. I can't remember the name of the guy he fought. I think. Oh, it
He was
was
nominated in a different category as well, I believe, that guy.
it was. I believe we have. Yeah, Matua.
Yes, John
John
Matua, right?
Matua. Not Hawaiian Art of Bone Breaking. And I mean, I get the only reason why I think we didn't include it, other than the potential that we just forgot, which we would never do. We're consummate professionals. is that some people actually think of it as like a legit martial art that they would practice and that has a long heritage and it has some sort of place in the canon of legitimate martial arts, like ninjutsu. As ridiculous as ninjutsu is, there are a lot of people who do ninjutsu and think it's actually something.
Yeah, and even with trap fighting, it's kind of a tight one because yes, trap fighting is a thing in kung fu, but I don't believe that Paul Varelans was a master of kung fu. So
No,
that's why we're going out on the limb with that one and saying that his style of trap fighting was not the real thing.
yeah, that was not the trap fighting he was referring to.
So
So
that's our golden Andy. Let's move ahead now with the next award.
yeah, our next one after that was the best submission, or no, best forgotten fighter, which has is all about those guys that we really feel like history has kind of forgotten and who were very good fighters. Very entertaining, fun fighters, guys who fought competitively a lot. The nominees were Mark Hall, Cal Warsham, Brian Johnston, Remco Pardoel, or Pardo, and Mark Schultz. And it ended up being a three-way tie between Schultz, Remco, and Johnston.
I'm
I
sorry,
think
actually,
this.
those my notes are a little off there. It's actually it was a tie
Oh,
between Schultz and Remco, and Brian Johnson actually came in second.
oh, Brian Johnston came in second. All right. So the tie between Schultz and Remco with Johnston in second, and uh, one of our writers, KJ Gould, or former writers, KJ Gould actually, said, it's a shame we have no idea how dominant Schultz could have been with a proper career. He was already training jiu-jitsu with Pedro Sauer at this point in time, I believe. One of Hickson's best black belts. First class Olympic freestyle wrestler, BJJ black belt within 4 years, and could probably hit like a truck. Would love to have seen him against Coleman, Maurice Smith, Randy Couture, Pedro Hizzo, and the rest. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that Schultz's MMA career, as incredibly brief as it was, has been largely forgotten. So it's hard to argue with him as a choice. But I have to admit, I have somewhat of a soft spot for Johnston. I'm not sure that he wouldn't have been my pick.
I agree. I'm actually surprised Remco came in second. I mean, I know Remco's still very active in mixed martial arts today, so that's probably was a big help to getting him that second, or getting him tied with Mark Schultz. Yeah, I actually was surprised there wasn't more love for Brian Johnson because he was really good. I mean, Schultz was amazing, of course, and we even said it on the UFC 9 episode that we would have loved to have seen a lot more of Mark Schultz, but we've also said the same thing about Brian Johnson, who had a much longer career in mixed martial arts. So for me, I'm a little stuck too on who I would actually vote for. If it would be Schultz or Johnston, and I think coming down to it, I think I'd actually have liked to have seen more of Johnston.
Yeah,
But either one would I would have been happy with any of them.
yeah, his career was cut really short, and it's kind of too bad because he was a very good pretty three-dimensional fighter at the time.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny also. Schultz has been talking a lot about the Foxcatcher movie, which is the story about him and his brother, and it's a good movie, definitely worth checking out. But you should also read his book, which is apparently a lot more accurate, obviously. And Schultz has been complaining a lot about the movie's portrayal of him and a lot of the events that relate to the story. And one of those things he actually didn't like was how it didn't really talk about his UFC career or his one fight in the UFC, because that was a pretty important thing for him to do. It was not that long after his brother had passed. It was a pretty big deal for the wrestling community as well as for himself to do that kind of a thing.
And it was on like a day's notice. I mean, it was literally just like, okay, I'm here. I guess I'll fight.
Yeah, he was replacing Dave Beneteau, who was supposed to fight against Goodrich, but got injured training the day of the
Yeah,
fight or whatever. So yeah, he didn't have anything to wear technically.
yeah.
So
That's why he was wearing those terry cloth shorts.
which made him look like a giant barbarian, which was pretty awesome.
It did. It was really great. Oh, yeah.
So
Schultz's UFC story is something else.
yeah, it's unfortunate he was he didn't come back for more, but hey, we got what we got, and that's our winner. It was Schultz and Remco. So congrats to them. They get a golden Andy. And our next category, which was one of our biggest categories, was the best submission. This one had Royce Gracie versus Jason DeLucia from UFC 2. Kimo Leopoldo versus Ken Shamrock from UFC 8. Ken Shamrock versus Pat Smith from UFC 1. Ken Shamrock versus Dan Severn from their first super fight at UFC 6. Royce Gracie versus Severn from UFC 4. Royce Gracie versus Remco Pardo from UFC 2. And Dan Severn versus Paul Varland, which I believe was Ultimate 96, I want to say. And again, very tough category. Tight field, but in the end, it was actually Royce Gracie versus Dan Severn that won. And Bloody Elbow writer Fraser Coffin said it best, hands down, this was a legendary submission, an early version of Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen, and just as dramatic.
Yeah, and Almond Book sort of summed up my feelings maybe a little more precisely, which was it's not the most exciting to watch, but I would say it was Royce's most impressive victory.
Yep, I
Like
agree with that.
that feels more fair to me because I mean Severn was not making much happen in that fight. It wasn't like the fight itself was not that thrilling.
No, it was basically 15 minutes of Royce on his back, wiggling around, being pounded on by Severn until he got the triangle choke.
It's true, and one of our mods, Victor Rodriguez, brought up that an honorable mention to Kimo versus Gracie, which was really a very brutal fight, and that was a pretty big submission for Royce. That felt like a much more taxing fight than Royce versus Severn even.
Yep. Yeah, I actually agree too. If you want to talk about drama, I'd probably put that one as a little bit more dramatic than Severn, just because Kimo was the first time we kind of saw someone punch holes in Royce Gracie's battle plan. This was a guy that came out swinging, was very strong, was dominant, and quite honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that Kimo had that stupid ponytail, I don't know what Royce would have done, because that's what helped him get that victory, was him grabbing that hair to finish the triangle choke. If he didn't have that to grab onto, I don't know what would have happened.
It's true. Although Kimo, I think, was gassing pretty hard. And one other reader, GZL 5000, asked, why no love for Taktarov versus Tank? Not the most technical submission, to be sure, but it sure was dramatic.
Yeah, I don't know why we forgot that one. I mean, we forgot nothing. It wasn't there because we didn't like it as much. That's why.
That's why.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, of all the things, and I mean, I'm not sure that. I think for me, I'm not sure that I don't like Hoist versus Pardoel the most. I don't know why. I just think technically it was the most fun because I think Pardoel Pardo in terms of actual submission, like defense and offense and exchanging, probably had the most to offer Hoist there. Like he was actually working the most actively to scramble with Hoist before getting submitted. That really made that fun to me.
Yeah, that was a very good fight. It's kind of one of those forgotten fights too. It was really a match of skill versus skill, even though Remco was so much bigger. They were pretty evenly matched, I'd say, for the time, considering what Remco's background was. He offered a very difficult challenge to Hoist with the fact that he was wearing a gi. He knew how to use the gi as well. It was a tough fight, and it was a very technical fight. For me, my winner in this, I wouldn't go at Hoist versus Dan Severn either. Because for me, the drama doesn't matter as much. There are so many other dramatic fights, and Hoist had plenty of dramatic fights where he's in trouble and then he wins in the end. It didn't do much for me. I think for me, I actually would have picked one of Ken Shamrock's fights because that was just, if you want to talk about technical submission, which is what I was looking for more so, I think Ken versus Severn, the first fight from UFC 6, that was a brilliant fight because Ken had scouted so well Dan Severn. He knew exactly what to expect from Severn. He caught him with the guillotine because Severn put his head down and Ken had scouted that. That was a brilliant tactic to do. And also, likewise, the UFC 8 super fight against Kimo, he wore those socks to help him get more traction on Kimo's sweaty body. He kind of had a game plan there. But if I had to choose, I think I'd actually go with Ken and Severn just because that was for the first ever super fight belt after Ken and Hoist had their draw. That was the first match to see who really was the best of the two top guys that were still there that weren't Hoist Gracie. The finish, it was a good fight. UFC 9, not so good, but we'll talk about that later. So my choice is Ken versus Severn from UFC 6. And oddly enough, I do need to mention, Shamrock got no votes at all in this category. He got no love whatsoever from any of the fans, which that surprised me a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Shamrock just doesn't get much love these days. He's kind of a pariah. So,
Which is unfortunate because he was the face of the UFC for a while. He was their
yeah.
super fight champion. He was the guy they pushed, and he was damn good at the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Ken Shamrock versus Severn, the first one, that was an amazing fight just for how quickly dominant Shamrock was in a situation that really, I mean, if you're watching at the time, and if you're watching with an eye for what happened to them both later and for the career paths they took, I think it's really surprising that Ken was as dominant as he was in that fight.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, so that leaves us brings us to our next category, best brawl, and the Golden Andy nominees. And this isn't best fight. This is the best ugly fight,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, let's really differentiate that because there was a little bit of discussion about that. This is, we have a category for best fight later on. This is the one that's just for the pure crazy slugfest.
Yeah. So this is our best ugly fight category. Golden Andy nominees are Rosier versus Frazier from UFC 1, Varland versus Worsham from UFC 6, Hall versus Howard at UFC 7, Goodrich versus Campatella, which I'm not sure. Oh, and
That was UFC 10, I want to say that one.
yeah, Abbott versus Ferrazzo at UFC 11. The tie was Abbott versus Ferrazzo and Varland versus Worsham.
So our second tie, which is surprising,
Yeah,
but it was a pretty tough category because all these fights are really fun to watch.
they are. Fork Boy 84 said of Tank versus Ferrazzo, it had it all as far as crazy early UFC brawling goes. While Booty Scoot said this was about said this about Varlins versus Worsham. I like the back and forth feeling of the fight despite the short period of time.
Yeah, and they both make good points. If I had to actually choose a clear-cut winner, I would go with Abbott versus Ferozzo, I think. But Varlin's Worsham is a very, very good brawl also. But for me, the Ferozzo fight with Abbott just it's not better because Ferozzo is just what you didn't expect what you got out of a guy like Ferozzo. That's really how I see it. For the first time we ever saw him at UFC 8, you didn't expect him to be the skill that he had for his size. And he really brought it all for Tank. He wanted that Tank fight. He wanted it more than I think anybody else in the UFC at the time. So I go with Abbott versus Ferozzo as my winner for this one.
Yeah, I think that really that for a brawl and for just an ugly fight really did have a lot going for it. Ferrazzo came in at a time when Tank was really not. I mean, he was at the top. Once again, like this was a time when sort of UFC was constantly churning over its talent. Like every two events, it felt like they were pushing a new guy really hard. And Tank was the guy that they didn't want to push, but was still one of their biggest faces at the time. And Ferrazzo just came in and put it on him.
And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a comment from rcard53762, who proved to us his inability to read the rules by asking, come on, Don Fry versus Tank Abbott was good, but what about Frank Shamrock versus Tito Ortiz, Mark Coleman versus Maurice Smith? He just went on to name a lot of really great old school matches that were not in our timeline, which we made very clear in the rules. So, rcard53762, you get called out for being illiterate.
Yes, that's always worth calling out. I mean, if you're spending time on the internet, you got to know how to read.
Seriously, y'all. Internet is serious.
Internet is serious business, folks.
But he does make a good point because he mentioned a lot of great fights, including Mario Sperry versus Igor Zinoviev, which is a really good fight. Tank Abbott versus Hugo Duarte. So yeah, great fights, but just not in our timeline. But maybe we'll get there one of these days.
Indeed.
So let's move on now to our next category, which was a really fun one for us, and that was the most memorable loser. And my God, there were so many of these, but we had narrowed down the list to a select few. And this would be Harold Howard, Joe Sun, Andy Anderson, the man these awards are named after, Paul Varlins, Art Jimerson, Fred Edish, and Emmanuel Yarbrough. So a very big category, very tough category. But in the end, the Golden Andy goes to Harold Howard. And Punk Rock Ronin, I think he said it best, and he said that he chose Harold Howard because he lost to a ninja.
It's true. That'd be Scott Harris, wouldn't it? Or was that? Oh no, who was the? I'm now remember
I think
forgetting.
you mean Scott Morris.
Oh, Scott Morris. Is that it?
Kidding. But I think he was ninja from UFC too.
Yeah.
Um,
Which ninja did Harold Howard lose to? He lost to
I think he might be referring to our
Steve
winner
Jenham.
of UFC 3. Yeah, because Jenham had some ninjutsu training.
Yeah, Steve Jenham was the other ninja, and Jenham and I think Morris actually trained together. Weirdly.
And Nesbitt also reminded us that technically Tom Lawler has already voted for Harold Howard because he dressed up as him during a UFC weigh-in a while back, so he got an extra vote unofficially because of that.
It's
Not that it
true.
mattered, because Howard would have won this regardless. And we have actually a really good comment from Atomic Salmon, who has an amazing name. And Atomic Salmon said, I work with a woman whose husband was offered a spot at the first UFC. He said that once he found out he'd be fighting Harold Howard, he declined. Apparently, he knew him from around town in southern Ontario, and that he was a little off his rocker. His wife, my coworker, basically told me that her husband didn't trust Howard to listen to the ref for anything. And then we all know what happened to him sometime later, which is true because Howard really did go off his rocker a little bit later on in life.
Yeah, there's a lot more to that story than just Howard being crazy, but being crazy certainly didn't help him when things got rough.
No, not at all. And yeah, like we said, this was a really tough category. Almost everybody got a vote in this one, with the exception, surprisingly and depressingly, of Andy Anderson, who got no votes at all. But that's fine, because this award is named after him, and it's shaped like him, and if it was a real thing, we'd have it right here on the screen, and it'd be awesome looking.
It's true.
But yeah, but commenter, the mouth DFW kisses his mom with, said that he thinks Andy Anderson works for Bloody Elbow right now, so it's all good anyway.
There's a commenter named Andy
I
Anderson
don't know
on
if
on the site, but I think I might have. And I would have gone with Paul Varland just because Varland. I have a soft spot for the guy. That would have been my choice over Howard, but Howard's a great choice.
Yeah, that's a tough one for me too. Because Marlins was a loser, but he did good. He was one of the losers in this category that actually did really well for himself for the most part. He had
Yeah,
tough fights. He went the distance. A lot of dudes. He made it further than he had more appearances, I should say, than anybody else. In terms of just biggest loser, I think probably Fred Edish for me because his story is so important to the history of the old school UFC, and I'd go with Edish in this one.
yeah, I could see that. I mean, he certainly made the story of his loss ended up being bigger than the story of anyone else's loss.
Yeah, and it went on to really drive him to actually pursue a comeback in mixed martial arts years later, which he won. So he redeemed himself, and he's still active in mixed martial arts today. So I go with that actually in this one, but tough category. And once again, we should mention that there was a lot of discussion over Joe Son being nominated because the dude is a d-bag. So
Yeah.
uh, again, a lot of discussion about Joe Son.
So our next category is KO. Best knockout. Always going to be a fun one. A lot of great knockouts in the early UFC. Our choices were Remco Pardo versus Orlando Veit at UFC 2. Pat Smith versus Scott Morris at UFC 2. Harold Howard versus Roland Payne at UFC 3. Tank Abbott versus John Matua at UFC 6. Gary Goodridge versus Paul Herrera at UFC 8. Don Fry versus Thomas Ramirez at UFC 8. And Tank Abbott versus Steve Nelmark at Ultimate 96. Uh, the winner of the Golden Andy is Gary Goodrich versus Paul Herrera with 10 votes, edging out Tank Abbott versus John Matua with 7, and Tank Abbott versus Steve Nelmark with 5. Those three, I think, are certainly the most memorable KOs of this category and of the available choices. I don't know if they'd be my choice. I think, I mean, Goodridge or Tank versus Matua was fantastic. And Goodridge versus Herrera was a highlight staple for a long time. But I might go with Pat Smith versus Scott Morris. There's something about hitting a guy so hard when his head's on the canvas that his mouthpiece pops up out of his mouth that just was really brutal.
Yeah, that is a very brutal one. I think that one, as well as Remco and Orlando Wheat from UFC 2, same event. Very forgotten, but very, very brutal knockout. I think that's really just the problem. This category is, Goodridge Herrera, which, by the way, Goodridge Herrera, regardless, would be my pick for this category as the winner. But Orlando Wheat and Remco Pardo, as well as Pat Smith and Scott Morris from UFC 2. Those are two of the most brutal early knockouts that just kind of get forgotten because they're not Tank Abbott or they're not Gary Goodridge or they're not Don Fry. But
Yeah,
they're great, great knockouts. Hard to watch, which is why they're so great.
yeah. And the mouth DFW Dana fucking White kisses his mom with on Goodrich. I planned to vote for this KO before even clicking on the article and seeing if it was an option.
Yeah, just like you said, it's pretty much a staple in highlight reels forever. There was
Yeah,
no way people weren't gonna just assume that was in there.
yeah. Forkboy84 also said, just straight up the most brutal shit I've seen in the sport that didn't involve literal broken bones.
But it actually did because Goodridge actually did break Herrera's jaw in that fight.
Yeah, and Vargas won, voted for Tank versus Matua, said although Goodrich is an awfully close second, but the mocking by Tank of his opponent seizing just fits so well with the ridiculousness it was early UFC.
Yeah, and that's a good point as to why you'd want to vote for Tank because that was a gorgeous knockout, but even better, it just really showed you who Tank Abbott was at the end. It gave you so that gets a lot of points just for style.
And yeah, one other commenter noted there was an error. We'd originally listed Julian Sanchez in the text, which I corrected. But it turns out that Julian Sanchez and Thomas Ramirez look a whole hell of a lot alike. So it's a very excusable error.
Yeah, it's no racism here, folks. For once on the show, they just really do look a lot alike. They're very similar in appearance and body size, and they both get knocked the fuck out. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Two huge guys wearing black t-shirts and black sweatpants with a very spherical body shape. It's easy to confuse.
Yeah, can you blame us, folks? Can you really blame us on this?
And if you can, don't. We don't want to hear it.
No, please don't, and please don't comment. All right, so let's move on to as we get closer to the finish here now with the worst fight ever. This is a good category, and this is also the category that had the most comments ever. I believe all of the votes. So we have Don Fry versus Mark Hall from Ultimate 96, Fred Edish versus Johnny Rhodes from UFC 2, Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock from UFC 9, the rematch, John Hess versus Andy Anderson from UFC 5, Shamrock versus Taktarov from UFC 7, Taktara versus Huas from Ultimate 95, and Paul Varlins versus Joe Moreira from UFC 8. So very big category, but in the end, it was an obvious choice, and that was Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock 2 from UFC 9, which had so many more votes than anybody else. It wasn't quite a landslide, but it was damn close to being a landslide victory for them. Yeah, what can you even say about this fight? Pat Zoo commented that it was disappointing at the time, and even more so now. Two Hall of Fame age, what a waste. And Nesbitt once again commented, he understood the issue of no closed fist striking, but everyone else in the card did it anyway. Why do those two think they couldn't get away with it?
Yeah, it really. That fight. There are a list of terminal diseases I think I'd rather have than ever watching that fight again.
Would you like to list those diseases for us?
No, I don't.
All right, and show us the dog on camera just so we could get those views back from people thinking about diseases.
Oh, Molly, you've been called up again. There, you have to help support our show, Mall. Okay, yeah, and likewise, the port said I actually watched the whole thing once, and I'm still a little pissed off with myself for doing so. It's a bad decision that sticks with you for a long time, really and truly.
My eyes still burn from that time we had to watch it on the show again.
And Forkboy84 said about it, the only fight I can think of that come close to it from where I'm at my MMA watching are from Pride 1 and Pride 2, Seven versus Chemo and Naoki Sano versus Hoyler Gracie. which are
Yeah,
good
and those are
additions.
really bad matches. Yeah, I think when we get to Pride at some point, we will discuss those in great depth because they are awful matches, especially Severn Chemo. And I think Severn Chemo might rival Severn Shamrock too, but we got to watch it to really see. We're gonna have to sit through that crap fest as well soon.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that. Okay, so this brings us to our a category that I think everybody was happy to talk about and look at and all that, which was best fight. And the nominations for best fight were Bolander versus Ferrazzo at UFC 8, Fry versus Goodridge at Ultimate 96, Fry versus Abbott at Ultimate 1996, Chemo versus Varlins at Ultimate 96, and Fry versus Johnston at UFC 10. And I think I gotta say, I think people, this was I think an early category that we didn't have best brawl out there yet, and maybe best KO and best submission. So there were a lot of fights that were very good that didn't fall into this category because this category was really just about the most competitive and interesting matchup as it played out in the ring, not necessarily about all the other things that can make a fight fun in those old days.
Yeah,
And
that's why we had our best brawl category to really separate those two because you can't really compare a fight like anything that's in our best brawl in most cases compared to a much more technical or dramatic showing that we have in this category. Although there could have been some that could have crossed over for sure, but then we would have had just way too huge of a category.
yeah, so the winner for this was Don Fry versus Tank Abbott from Ultimate 96. And Eddie B said of Tank vs. Fry, it was the perfect fight to close the door on the no holds barred period of the UFC. Short and violent, just like the era.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, there are a lot of people who were saying the earlier shows didn't get a lot of love in this category as well. Um, and Hoist vs. Chemo actually got a few write-ins, which wasn't
Yeah,
listed here. We talked about it a little bit earlier, saying how Hoist vs. Chemo was a very good match for Hoist. Yeah, we probably actually should have had that in this category,
it's
but
true.
yeah, we left that one out. We did just kind of we got so into the later UFCs because quite frankly they're technically speaking much better fights without a doubt. Um, so we kind of lost some of the drama, I guess, of the earlier UFCs. And Hoist vs. Chemo is a good fight, but does it hold up when it's put next to Don Fry versus Brian Johnston? On a technical level, not at all. On a dramatic level, more so, definitely. So
Yeah.
that was a tough one, but we were going to this category more for just good overall actual fights. This one, I think I'd have to agree. Although I do have a soft spot for Bolander versus Ferozzo, but I think I'm going to go with Fry versus Abbott here as well. I'm going to go with the bloody elbow readers on this one.
I'm actually going to go with Bolander versus Ferrazzo. That one really sticks out to me. And I can remember, like, Bolander choking him with his singlet and all that. That was just such a cool, fun fight to watch.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, that's definitely, I think, my second choice. And my third would probably be Chemo versus Varlins, which is an odd choice. But again, on that technical level, this was a surprising fight that showed these two guys that were known for being brawlers were actually able to start fighting on a little bit more of a technical, smarter level. Like they were learning, they were improving. And it kind of showed that, the day of the big, strong, tough man who didn't know anything were fading out. And even the tough guys were now learning how to really fight because they knew if they didn't, they were going to get beaten and their careers would be over very quickly.
Yeah, Chemo versus Varlins is a seriously underrated fight for people who, probably have largely dismissed both men as just sloppy, talentless brawlers. That was a really good fight.
Yeah, so that's our winner. That's time for, I believe, our final category, which is the best event ever. And that's a very big name, even though it's not ever. It's basically just from UFC 1 to Ultimate 96. But hey, it's the best event ever for this award show. And our nominees are UFC 2, UFC 6, Ultimate 95, UFC 8, UFC 9, and the Ultimate 1996. And this one was a landslide win for UFC 8, the David vs. Goliath tournament from Puerto Rico. Yeah, and quite frankly, the only non-UFC 8 votes were from two people who both voted for UFC 2. And to be fair, UFC 2 is pretty great. It's pretty epic because it was the 16-man tournament. But UFC 8 was just amazing top to bottom show. Great fights. There's only one real stinker in that entire show that we saw. Um, I think for me, it's definitely either UFC 8 or UFC Ultimate 96. But yeah, I used to love UFC 8 a lot, and I still do to this day. So yeah, amazing event. Uh, Bloody Elbow staffer Fraser Cofen, once again, he voted for UFC 8 because he said, if I could, I would do a write-in vote for either UFC 4 or 7, both of which he really loved, and they had the greatest drama in the tournaments, which is the biggest selling point in these early shows. So he voted for UFC 8, but brought up some good points about 2 other shows, but we can't pick them all, unfortunately, or else this category would get way out of hand really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with a lot of those earlier shows was just that they offered some fun, but I mean, they could. Some of them were really good. UFC 4 was generally really solid, and UFC 7 was not. Shamrock versus
Yeah,
Tag Drop in a 33-minute draw was terrible, and Huas versus Varlins was not good. So at the top of that show. That show was really bad. At the under part of it was not, it was fun. But some of those early shows were good, but then there were a lot of pacing issues that they were trying to figure out, and that some of the like the drama was bigger than the fights themselves. A lot of which just turned out to be like these really quick, talentless affairs. So I think that's why a lot of them didn't get as much love for us. I mean, UFC 2 is definitely one of my favorite early shows of all time. I think that far and away it's a better show than UFC 1. But otherwise, UFC 8 is just so much fun. David versus Goliath, the whole premise, everything about that show is just fantastic.
Yeah, and the skill level essentially matched what we were being hyped for. And it gave us, a lot of great highlight reel moments, a lot of great fights, a lot of great brawls. UFC 2, again, that's one of my favorites of all time, but I think that's more of a novelty factor because it was the only 16-man tournament. That's really exciting. It was kind of like a Royal Run once. And there's a lot of finishes, too. That was a very good show. UFC 6 also, surprisingly good show. These were really good events overall, and as we saw in the early UFCs, even the earlier shows, if they weren't great, they were still at least pretty good for the most part. But yeah, UFC 8, I'm going with that one as well. Like I said, I agree. And UFC 8 is officially the best event ever in the Old School MMA Review Awards, first edition.
Well, that brings us to a close. We're going to be reviewing UFC 12 soon. I think that's next on the docket. And try to get through another era of classic UFC events and time, and maybe even move over to some other promotions, Pride, and I don't know. What was the promotion? Was it Extreme Fighting, maybe something like that for a bit, for the next year, in time for another awards show next year.
Yeah, and hopefully we also start getting these videos out a lot more regularly. I'm hoping that's going to be the case for myself. I'm going to do my best because most of the time it's usually my fault that we're delayed. So we're going to try and get these things done a lot quicker, a lot faster, and a lot better. And we definitely are going to need to because I'm thinking this span of shows, we're going to look at UFC 12 all the way up to 22. I'm thinking that's the way to go, and there's a lot of events. I think 22 is a good stopping point. And then we will see what's next. Might be more UFC, might be some Battlecade. Because at that point in history, we're going to get some good shows. So we will see how things go from here on out. Zane, I think we're going to need also a new way to finish our shows now because I got nothing. Do we still have nothing? I don't know.
Maybe we have stuff. I don't know. Maybe we have stuff. Can that be our new show-ending catchphrase?
I'm going to put a pin in that for now. We're going to workshop that one. Okay. Maybe the Bloody Elbow readers can let us know how they want us to finish the shows from now on.
Yeah, help us come up with a tagline because I still got nothing.
We got nothing.
All right, I think on that note, we should call it a day before we spiral off the deep end.
Yeah, we got nothing, folks. Thanks for watching. We're going to be back very soon with our review of UFC 12, so stay tuned for that. I'm not going to say Seacrest out this time because this is an award show. This is classy. So Happy New Year and welcome to the next generation of UFC. We'll see you soon.